In the Gospel of John, Jesus doesn't perform miracles. John never uses the word miracle. Jesus performs signs. And the sign that was performed in this story was the giving of sight. After Jesus performs signs in the Gospel of John, he engages in dialogue with people to help them understand not only the sign itself, but also the greater meaning of the sign of being given sight. Not only to see the world, but to see who Jesus is, and to not only see who Jesus is, but to learn to see how Jesus sees the world. That is the gift that is given in this story. We can get sidetracked by the question that is asked at the beginning of the passage. Who sinned? The questioners ask Jesus, the blind man, or his parents? Jesus' response is important because we are those who often search for the relationship between human suffering and the cause of the suffering. Who caused the suffering is at the heart of this question. Whose fault is it? Jesus refuses to look for a culprit for the man's suffering. It's not his fault, Jesus says, or his parents' fault. The man was born that way. Just as much suffering is born into this fallen world. While we can acknowledge and admit and confess that much suffering is caused by our sinful human behaviors, such as an affair that leads to a broken marriage, we cannot work backwards from the reality of suffering to root it in sin. Because someone has cancer is not because they or their parents did something wrong. Jesus refuses to get caught in that trap. He acknowledges the man's situation, saying he was born blind. But Jesus doesn't spend time trying to find the culprit or the causality. Instead, Jesus sees the man's blindness, his real situation, as an opportunity for the work of God to be displayed. Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in this situation. In other words, the good news of this passage is no matter our situation, our suffering, our distress, God can overcome all human finitude. God can work in the midst of all human suffering. God can reveal God's love and grace in all of our impairments and challenges. God is not limited by the things born of this world. In fact, God can work God's grace and love and wonders and the signs of God's grace and love and wonders in and through all situations. And so Jesus abandons quickly the question of blame and moves quickly on to the work of healing, the work of God. It's daylight, says Jesus. Let us work while we can see. Night is coming. Elsewhere in the passage, we learn that all of this took place on a Sabbath day, the Lord's Day. And the Pharisees' critique of Jesus was somewhat rooted in their ironic criticism of Jesus for doing this healing work on the Lord's Day. Jesus says, I am the light of the world. I am here to do the Lord's work. If you are with me, you will always be able to see. And he spits in the dust, puts the mud on the man's eyes, and sends him to wash in the pool of Siloam. Siloam, a word that means sent. It may be a reference to Jesus being sent from God. It may be a reference to those of us who have known or experienced Jesus being sent out to share his healing love and grace with the world. The man was sent to wash in the pool named Sent. And he washes and returns, able to see. For the first time in his life, able to see. Can you imagine? Any who have experienced the loss of sight, macular degeneration, cataracts, the loss of sight that happens as we age, or the loss of sight caused by other illness, knows how precious that gift of sight is, even more precious as it's being lost. But this man had been born blind. He had never seen the light of day. He had never seen another human face. He had never experienced color. Can you imagine how astonishing that experience at the hand of Jesus must have been? While the healing act in this story happens rather quickly, the true revelation of the story is quite gradual. Like last week's text, in which the woman at the well gradually came to understand who Jesus was, the blind man grows in his understanding throughout the story, and his repeated conversations with Jesus and with the interrogations with the Pharisees and his neighbors and even his parents and his friends, all who are questioning, how could this be? Are you really the man who was born blind? Did this really happen to you? Over and over again, the man says, it was Jesus. It was he who did this. He's a prophet. He's from God. He is the one who gave me my sight. What do we need in order to see? Light and eyes that can clearly see the light. Jesus says, I am the light of the world, and Jesus offers us his light by which to see the world, that we might come to see the world more clearly, that we might come to see our lives and the world as God sees them. Jesus opens our eyes, sometimes through the very messy stuff of life itself, mud and saliva, symbols of the messiness of life itself. Because once our eyes have been opened, once we've seen more clearly, we can never go back. Let's be honest, when we go through times of change in our lives, those messy times of changing and growing, conversion times in our lives, those are often very messy times, and sometimes they grow out of the messes we make of life. Sometimes our growing, our coming to see, our new experience of insight, our faith, sometimes that comes and grows in the midst of the painful messes in our lives and our complicated relationships with our egos, with our need to prove ourselves or our worth through our affluence and all of the ways that gets us mixed up sometimes, our jealousies, our dysfunctional relationships, our aspirations that are somehow self-interested more than other-interested, our search for love, our search for meaning, all of that can be messy stuff. But in the midst of it all, sometimes using the very messiness of it itself, God reaches in and touches us. Touches our eyes or our ears or our mouths or our hearts or touches us, not because we deserve it, but because we need it, because we were born needing God's love, because we were born needing God's grace. God's healing, God's grace, God's love comes and finds us and sends us off to wash in the waters of baptism. Again and again and again, in the waters of grace and forgiveness and renewal, again and again and again, as people of faith, our eyes are opened, and again and again and again we see, as God would have us see, the truth that grace and love are gifts from God, life-changing gifts, gifts we need, and gifts we need to share with the world. Time and again, as we steadily worship and pray and confess our sin and read God's Word and listen to God's Word as it permeates our lives and our thinking and our choices and our actions, over time our eyes are opened and we start to see the world and our part in it more clearly as God would have us see. I think part of being a Christian is being able to admit that we can change. See how hard it is to admit that we can change? Do you ever have trouble admitting that you can change? Excuse me. I think part of being a Christian is being able to admit that we can change, or that we need to change, or that we have somehow been changed. Over and over again, those who saw the difference in the formerly blind man asked him, "Is it really you? Did this really happen to you?" They even asked the parents, "Is this really your son? Did this happen to your son?" The formerly blind man says over and over, "It's me. I'm the same person, only I've changed. Now I can see. This man Jesus, he changed me. He made me see." Part of being a Christian is being able to be open to the experience of God changing us and admitting that, professing that, claiming that change to others. Once I saw it like this. Now I see it this way. Once I believed this. Now I believe this. Once I lived this way. Now I live this way. Following Jesus changes us and changes the way we see things and it changes the way we do things. Being a Christian changes us from the inside out, and it changes our relationships with others, with our world. As followers of Jesus, we know that God is at work in real ways in the world, in and through us to this day. And we are in the process of allowing God to work in and through us, to change the world. We cannot follow Jesus to the cross without being willing to be changed. Changed by his devotion. Changed by his love. Changed by his forgiveness. Changed by his willingness to suffer for the sake of the world, changed by his example of life-giving love for others.